966.
Richard, on last week's episode, we talked about the huge transformation going on in Saudi Arabia's defense and security sector with author Bilal Saab, who has a book coming out on the subject. In that book and in our conversation with Bilal, he also talked about the role of the United States military training mission, USMTM, in that significant transformation. If you missed that conversation, check it out on our website, YouTube channel. One person who did not miss our talk on the Saudi military transformation and USMTM's role in it was the head of USMTM from 2019 to 2021, Colonel Brad Gandy, who agreed to join us today on the 966 to talk about it. Brad, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
This is ideal, Brad. We wanted to, when we set up the 966, we wanted to create a platform that generates informed conversation about real topics in Saudi Arabia. And we wanted to attract expertise, and we've plugged in our network. But this is the ideal situation where we had an expert, someone who literally, is, a big part of the conversation with Bilal was the U.S. military training mission in Saudi Arabia, which is the heartbeat, ground zero of U.S. Saudi defense cooperation. And so we're honored and thrilled that you were listening, and then just delighted that you gave us a call. So this is a really bonus. Thanks so much for joining us.
No, thank you for having me. It's you guys do a lot of really cool stuff for the relationship, and so I'm thrilled to be here. So thank you.
Appreciate it. Brad's got one of the more impressive resumes out there. Before serving as head of USMTM in Saudi Arabia, he served as a senior U.S. defense official and defense attache to Yemen. He also served as U.S. Army attache to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia between 2006 and 2010. Brad, I think it makes sense to start by talking a little bit about what USMTM is, some history, and what roles it plays in the U.S.-Saudi relationship.
So, USMTM has been around in one form or another, really in many ways since the 1950s. Although shortly after the Second World War, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia began to acquire things like old CH-47 Dakotas. A lot of people have seen pictures of the founder of Saudi Arabia, King Abdulaziz, flying around the kingdom in old CH-47 aircraft. Those were basically surplus World War II aircraft that were purchased sort of in the waning years of the war, and then afterwards. And those were some of the original aircraft owned by Saudi Arabia. There's even a famous story about Abdulaziz having a special chair installed in the middle of the fuselage, so that he could look around in all different directions as they flew over his kingdom. And so in many ways, it's striking. That little anecdote is striking because it shows how even in the earliest days of its founding, the Saudis were leveraging their defense partnerships to enable the royal family and the emerging governance structures of the kingdom to be able to do a better job of getting around and seeing what was going on. And that is something that continues to this day. In its current incarnation, USMTM has been around since 1977. And that's the date of sort of the latest set of governing accords in terms of the U.S. military training mission's presence in the kingdom and so on. And it is, in many ways, the largest security cooperation organization in the world, both in terms of personnel and in terms of scope of activity and certainly scale of activity. And it really became a large part of the defense partnership in the wake of the Gulf War in 1990. After that, the Saudis began to really invest heavily in their defense capabilities, purchasing F-15 aircraft, purchasing all kinds of naval equipment from the United States and from other countries, and then also significant amounts of ground combat systems, tanks, artillery systems, radars. The list goes on, is about as long and as extensive as you can make it. And so, in many ways, The job of USMTM has been to facilitate the foreign military sales process for the kingdom. Kind of real quick, what is foreign military sales, FMS? That is the government to government contracts process by which other countries, Saudi Arabia, many of our European allies, basically anybody around the world, works with the United States government to acquire U.S. military systems. This could be anything from M1 tanks to artillery systems to computer software. It's kind of the gamut. It kind of depends on what it is. The best example in the kingdom's case is the F-15 SA for Saudi Arabia program, which is the largest foreign military sales contract in the world, and it is delivering the F-15 SA fighter aircraft, and has been delivering over the years to the kingdom. And so basically, the way FMS works, just very quickly, is essentially countries rent, if you will, the United States military acquisition system. So Saudi Arabia pays into a trust fund, and then the U.S. defense acquisition system provides the military equipment. And not just for the kingdom, but for all our customers globally. The United States Department of Defense's policy is on, and it's been this way for decades, is we do what's called full package support. So it's not, we don't just provide an aircraft. We provide the training, not just how to operate it, but how to maintain it. And then we also do the provide all the maintenance and technical support for that system is going to need over the lifetime of its utility in the particular country, in this case, Saudi Arabia. So and so that's what USMTM's been doing for certainly like I said, in its modern incarnation since 1977, and that is it's a big job. And it's an important one, and it's been doing it very well. I mean, roughly speaking, over the last, say, roughly 40 years, I mean, the scope of foreign military sales to the kingdom is right around $1 trillion. That's a lot of business, and more importantly, that's a lot of American jobs that have been sustained, in some cases created, over the years of the partnership, and it is and it's significant. So I'll kind of pause there and see what else is on your mind.
Yeah, that's a really good point about the FMS and the job creation. The other thing about the foreign military sales, and I think doing business with the U.S., is you referenced it, the service and the ongoing maintenance and training that comes in the context of the FMS relationship. Because I know in comparison to many other countries will just sort of drop the hardware off, say you paid for it. But there isn't the requisite training and maintenance, systems put in place. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. The list of the examples of other countries who sell their respective partners a naval destroyer with no engines, no communications, and no guns are legion. I'll refrain from diming out particular offenders, but yeah, those examples are legion here, throughout the world. The United States does not do that, and for good reason. I mean, not only is it bad business, but it's bad for the partnerships and the alliances we have.
Right. So the maker of the F-15, McDonnell Douglas, right?
Yes.
So if they in essence are in an FMS context, they're contracting with the U.S. military. They're contracting with you, right?
Well, not with USMTM, but with the Department of Defense. So when I say the FMS process rents the the U.S. military acquisition. That's exactly what I mean. So the F-15 program office that, provides the F-15 aircraft to the United States Air Force also has a separate division that works the F-15 SA program.
Right. And just for context for our listeners, that when you say largest security cooperation organization in the world, you're talking that FMS, U.S. Saudi Arabia FMS sales activity, that's valued in excess of 100 billion, correct?
Yeah, and that's been the case year in, year out over, for about 20 years. It's a big program.
Yeah, extraordinary. It must have been fascinating running it.
Yes, it was.
How many personnel?
It kind of depends, varies depending on the size of the case, or how many cases we have, and so on and so forth. But a shade over 200 people,
Yeah,
and
impressive.
that's big for a security cooperation organization. Most are manned somewhere, in the tens and twenties and of people.
So, as we look at the arc of Saudi Arabia's purchases and the relationship via USMTM, in terms of the technical system-based defense equipment, basically the hardware that Saudi Arabia has, what's your assessments of their defense capabilities? There's always these rundowns of X number of fighter planes, X number of ships and tanks and that sort of thing. That doesn't necessarily speak to fighting capability, but I'd be interested in your assessment of where they are in terms of their military hardware.
Well, in terms of the purchases that they've made over going back really to the end of the Gulf War, and in 1991, and then subsequently, the Saudis have made, I think, some smart investments. A lot of airspace over the Arabian Peninsula that needs to be defended from, multiple bad actors. So systems like, the F-15 SA, the AWACS that the Saudis bought in the 80s, from the Reagan administration and so on. Those are smart. Those are very smart investments. Similarly, the Navy has not gone out and, the Saudis don't need aircraft carriers, but they do need destroyers. They do need ships capable of patrolling and maintaining a presence along the kingdom's littoral, which is in the Persian Gulf and along the Red Sea. Because the Saudis are constrained by three of the world's major global choke points. You have the Strait of Hormuz in the Arabian Gulf. You have the Bab el-Mandeb at the southern end of the Red Sea, and at the north end of the Red Sea, you have the Suez Canal. And so, littoral security matters to the kingdom. So they've made some smart investments there. And then their land forces. You have both. Now, to be very clear here, my focus was on the Ministry of Defense in terms of the Royal Saudi Land Forces. And that is USMTM's role. We didn't play a role with the Saudi Arabia National Guard. That's a separate program, separate ministry. But in terms of land combat power, the Saudis have a large and they've purchased and invested heavily in modern ground combat systems. The M1 Abrams tank. Modern U.S. howitzer systems, artillery systems, and so on and so forth. And then, long-standing partnerships with any number of wheeled vehicle manufacturers in the United States.
So the very fortunate road that brings us here to this conversation with you, Colonel Gandy, started actually with an article written by Bilal Saab, a defense expert, in which he was talking about resetting the Saudi relationship. And in it, he said, what's underway in Saudi Arabia and what is little known is a massive, profound military transformation. And that was really the motivation to get in touch with Bilal and have that conversation. One of the interesting things he said on the U.S. side, there was initial impetus to have defense management specialists from Washington come in and handle that relation, help with that transformation. What happened, and this is according to Bilal, but it was that the Saudis were more familiar with the USMTM relationship and those relationships. And so is it fair to say that in terms of U.S. participation in this military transformation, that it's of the Royal Land Forces, not the National Guard, as you point out, is being led by USMTM?
No, no. I mean, let me. I think there's a way to better characterize. And I think you have to go back and kind of start. How did Saudi military transformation come about? Where's it trying to go? How does the U.S. government play a role?
Yeah.
Because I think the thing, the bottom line is the United States Department of Defense is fully in support of what the Saudis are trying to do. There are, I think, kind of as in any large organization, there are some discussions about how to handle business better. But support for the Saudi transformation is, across the U.S. Department of Defense. There is support for it, whether that's at DSCA or U.S. Central Command, or from a policy perspective within the Office of the Secretary of Defense. But so bearing that in mind, back in 2015, 2016, the Saudis began to realize that they needed to do better in their defense establishment. They knew that they had a lot of the really good systems, but they really decided they wanted to be a real partner with the United States in being an exporter of security and stability for the region. And so to that end, one of the things that they started to do was they're starting to transform how their military does business comprehensively. And it has resulted in the achievement of, and they're looking at this as a 10-year process to achieve. But they have already made substantial gains in what they're trying to do. For example, they have created now what's called the Assistant Ministry of Defense for Executive Affairs. That is a direct equivalency to the U.S. Department of Defense's Office of the Secretary of Defense. And so what that organization does is that provides the governance for strategy, policy, procurement, and administration that OSD provides for the uniformed services. Separately, they are reforming their joint staff, and then they seek to transform their armed services from the quasi-operational organizations that they are right now into force-generating organizations that are then man, train, equip, and then provide trained and ready forces to a unified command. And so really what they're doing is they are adopting the direct, acquire, generate, and operate model for force management that is common in the United States and most of our NATO allies. And so to that end, that's where they're headed. And that is, and in so doing, what they hope to achieve, and I think what they will achieve eventually is they're going to become in many ways, I think the security partner of choice for the United States in the region in terms of ensuring regional security and stability in what is, by anybody's definition, a pretty rough neighborhood.
Absolutely. And I want to come back. I like that, exporting security and stability. We can unpack that farther down the road in the conversation. So essentially, they're trying to remake, in essence, not only operational but the soldier ethic. I mean, they're trying to fundamentally transform the whole culture as well as the operational mode. Is that correct?
Well, so Saudi Arabia, and what most people don't realize is Saudi Arabia actually has a really long military history, going back to, I mean, if you look at the story of the founder of Saudi Arabia, Abdulaziz, roughly speaking, from about the beginning of the 20th century, and certainly from about the early aughts of the 1900s through the final battle against the Ikhwan in 1929 at the Battle of Sibilla, Abdulaziz was in personal combat for almost 20 years of his life. And oh, by the way, forging a kingdom while he did it. And it's interesting if you look at the story of the founding of Saudi Arabia, particularly when the Saudis took over the Hijaz. One of the knocks against Arab militaries historically has been decentralized operations. What's fascinating about that story, about as the Saudis assumed rule over the Hijaz, Abdulaziz never personally conducted any of the major military operations that resulted in taking Mecca, taking Medina, taking Jeddah. Those were all done by subordinates of his, while he was busy running a kingdom, and and putting in place the structures appropriate to the kingdom of the time. And so interestingly enough, it was in the campaigns to subdue the Ikhwan, the recalcitrant tribes at the time in the late 1920s, that you had the first episode of defense cooperation between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and a Western power. That was when the Royal Air Force, the British Royal Air Force, provided a small number of aircraft and pilots to support Abdulaziz's efforts against the Ikhwan. And there are famous paintings of the aircraft arriving in those early days, and that was the start of what we now call the modern Royal Saudi Air Force.
And that was a decisive assistance. That was very helpful to that effort. Yeah,
absolutely.
We've talked about Ibn Saud, King Abdulaziz, and his extraordinary career, and also his really astute political and military judgment. I've likened him as a Saudi George Washington, but in many ways he's more than that. All the way from that nighttime raid in January 1902 to take over Diriyah in the first place. As I see, he and his 40 of his best friends sort of riding across the desert at night. Then to as you say, that's 1902. 1929 was the Battle of Sibilla. So exactly, he was an extraordinary figure. So. And you give us a good sense of where they are, and when we talked earlier this week, Colonel Gandy, and anybody who's knowledgeable about Saudi Arabia, you emphasized again and again that this is going to take time.
Yep.
Who's the motivation behind this? Was there somebody who came in and said, "Okay, we've got to remake how we address our defense institutions"?
Well, I think in many ways, it goes back to a lot of the decision making that was going on as Vision 2030 was being created. They also took a look at their defense sector, and although defense transformation is not, I guess, officially a part of Vision 2030, and some of that kind of depends on how you parse that a little bit. But it is certainly a corollary effort, and it envisions creating a modern professional military, that is capable of, first world standard joint and combined operations, and that allows the kingdom to be a part of international coalitions and to support efforts at ensuring regional, even global peace and stability. And so that's where they want to get their forces to. And so that is precisely why, they're putting in and creating and then, and putting in things like, the Assistant Ministry of Defense for Executive Affairs, their version of OSD to provide that top level policy and acquisition and administrative governance. It's why the uniformed services are focusing and reforming into organizations much more akin to the functions that the U.S. Armed Service staffs provide to the U.S. military. And oh, by the way, most of the NATO allies and NATO member countries operate the same way. In terms of the service staffs, the Air Force, the land forces, the Navy, focusing on the manning, training, and equipping functions, and then providing those forces to a unified command that the Saudis call their Joint Forces Command, which then operates those forces as needed, and in support of whatever activity the kingdom has going on at the time.
So if Saudi Arabia, and I guess this is akin to exporting security and stability, the ability to do that. So if Saudi Arabia becomes proficient at this, can you elaborate a little bit on what that would mean for the U.S. as it approaches its security priorities in the region and elsewhere?
Oh, it absolutely 100% enables and the United States to, for lack of a better term, to basically be able to focus per our own national defense strategy against peer-to-peer competitors in Russia and China. It's really hard to focus on the Indo-Pacific or everything that's going on in Europe now with clearly in light of everything that's happened over the last month in Ukraine. Certainly a revanchist Russia that is absolutely not interested in being a contributor to peace and security in the global order. It's really hard to focus on those two significant peer or near peer threats and competition if you're also at the same time constantly having problems in an area of the world that has that contains in arguably the bulk of the known fossil fuel resources for energy, and you keep getting sucked in to to incidents in the Middle East. If the Saudis are able to be that partner and essentially become the nation that shoulders the bulk of, if you will, the ensuring peace and stability, not just in the Arabian Peninsula, but the Middle East region writ large, then all of a sudden, that is something the United States doesn't have to worry about in the same way it did 10, 20, 30 years ago. You have examples of where, the Carter Doctrine said, the United States will treat any move by any foreign power to threaten energy, the free flow of energy resources out of the Persian Gulf as a threat to, a significant strategic threat to the United States interests. Well, if we have a partner, in this case, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, that can essentially do that on their own, then that is all to the good for the United States.
It's fascinating because you put a finger on this. Is 2015, 2016 when this thinking began and this transformation was started. It coincides a little bit, as you know, the Saudis are somewhat disenchanted with U.S. policy of late. I think starting with that October 2019 attack on Abqaiq, which there was no response to. Speaking of the Carter Doctrine, and then the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which many people in the region found unsettling. So it's interesting how they're already on this path internally, it seems to be meeting up right now with a little bit of disenchantment with U.S. foreign policy towards the region.
Well, so first off, I would take issue that there was no response to the attacks on the oil fields. In fact,
is it fair to say from the Saudi perspective it was insufficient?
no, I don't. I wouldn't. I wouldn't care. I would not characterize that. When the first ever operational deployment of a U.S. THAAD battery to anywhere occurs, that's a significant step, and it's placed, precisely to help defend the kingdom against a clearly identified and ongoing threat from Iran. That being said, it also, I think, demonstrated that going forward, the kingdom, in order to achieve its stated goals, needs to be able to kind of do this thing on these sorts of activities on their own. So that, for example, one of the things that most people don't know, I think it is that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has purchased 7 THAAD batteries.
Is that right?
To give you an idea of the magnitude of that purchase, that's the same number that the United States Army has for operations worldwide.
Wow.
And
when are those deliverable?
So, the initial case was signed in 2017. Because production lines had to be restarted. It wasn't like there were THAAD batteries sitting around off the shelf. By the end of the decade, those batteries and the crews, and the trained crews and everything to support them will be up and operating. And that will give Saudi Arabia the largest amount of concentrated anti-ballistic missile firepower of just about anybody in the world.
That's extraordinary. I didn't know that, and that's good to hear. But it also leads me to the next question. For example, Abqaiq, or what the Houthis are doing now, and when they're the asymmetric aspect of this, throwing in armed drones and cruise missiles, which I guess THAAD is not designed for.
Actually it is. I mean, you have the incident that just happened in the UAE where you had the UAE has 2 THAAD batteries. One of those systems shot down a Houthi ballistic missile recently.
And that's a ballistic missile, yeah. And so are we involved at all in steps to try and counter these asymmetric attacks?
Absolutely.
In other words, significantly below the level of a ballistic missile.
Absolutely. And I can tell you from my personal involvement in that process over 2 years, the Saudis have made enormous strides in being able to address those threats, and they have done remarkably successfully. I mean, personally, I'm sitting here, with all 10 fingers and all 10 toes, precisely because of Saudi air defense. Because I happen to have been in places that were on target lists, and thanks to the good efforts of the Royal Saudi Air Defense Force and the Royal Saudi Air Force, nothing happened. That's a good thing.
It is a good thing. So let me ask you a sort of off the reservation question, maybe not. What's your assessment of where the U.S. Saudi defense relationship is right now? And I say this because we see at the political sphere, this especially after Ukraine, relationships with Russia and China. We don't know, and they are dealing with China for missiles and that sort of thing. But what's your sense of the U.S. Saudi defense relationship, both now and as vis-a-vis and in comparison with previous time periods?
So there has always been a very strong mill-to-mill connection between the United States and Saudi Arabia, and that relationship has always remained strong in spite of disagreements over other issues. Going back to going back to, for example, the OPEC embargo, 1973. There were a lot. Literally, oil tankers full of ink were expended on, on phrases like the oil weapon at the time. The partnership continued, in spite, despite all that.
Right.
And that remains true today. I mean, even when you had, a lot of angst at political levels during my entire time as the in the saddle, and oh, by the way, this is also true, kind of from the perspective of when I was the senior defense official for Yemen, but was coordinating with the Saudis on various things as well. It never impacted my ability to talk to any of my counterparts on various things, and that's a sign of the strength of the relationship, and the importance of it, because circumstances are going to change over time vis-a-vis geopolitical issues, but what doesn't change, and I don't think is likely to change, is the commitment of lots of both the U.S. Department of Defense and certainly the Saudi Ministry of Defense in their understanding and belief in the importance of the bilateral security partnership.
I couldn't agree more. And as you say, that USMTM relationship goes back to the 50s, but even before that, that mill-to-mill relationship is a foundational backbone of the relationship, and that's not only because of the security aspect, but the interpersonal relationships.
Yes.
That have been built over time and are profound and very real, and they're the glue in many ways, beyond all the policy. So let's move back a little bit, because you've had an extraordinary career, and you mentioned Yemen. You've had key leadership roles in Kuwait, Iraq, Sudan, Tunisia, and Yemen. As you proudly recall, you grew up in Libya. You did.
Yep.
So you're steeped in this region. And one of the things when you were attaché, a military attaché in 2006, 2010. You were involved with some of that battle against Al Qaeda in Saudi Arabia. Can you talk a little bit about the defeat of extremism in Saudi Arabia? Because I think that's little known in the U.S. how aggressive and violent and determined those attacks were, and that how had to be very terrifying for Saudi Arabia and citizens and government alike.
Oh, it was. I mean, when in the early days of that fight, a couple of years before I got to Saudi in 2006, you had tanker truck size improvised explosive devices taking out, entire neighborhoods in various compounds. Things were bad. When I got to the kingdom in 2006, I remember the horrible incident where a bunch of French citizens were killed while they were at a tourist site. They took a wrong turn on the wrong road, and were targeted and killed by Al Qaeda members out in the western part of the kingdom. There were lots and lots of people who were really uncertain about the future of, the relationship with the kingdom. That was in 2006. By 2010, they had defeated 100% an insurgency in their country. And they had done it without significant measures of popular repression. That's the remarkable thing about it. One of the things that I think most people are very unaware of is the Saudis made extraordinary efforts to enlist and ensure that the parents of young men, in particular, who got swept up in and seduced by some really sick, twisted individuals that belonged to Al Qaeda, to get the parents involved to make sure that they began to help these guys come back to the right, the right way of thinking and doing business, and conduct, and that proved to be largely successful. And and so when you see them achieve all this, and then I left in 2010, it was, I guess the best way to describe it is the immediate fight against Al Qaeda had been won, but it was unclear if the gains would be able to be sustained. So then when I came back 8 years later to take over my duties as the senior defense official for Yemen, I was completely blown away by all the progress and development that had been made. And I remember going to one of the new malls that had been built up on the north side of the city and walking through and realizing and seeing all the changes that were, part of the emerging efforts with Vision 2030, and realizing, what went through my head was, wow, we won. The good guys won. And that is 100% why the Vision 2030 is so important, and why, it matters so much, is because, assuming, the broad objectives of Vision 2030 are met, broadly defined as the kingdom replacing oil as the main pillar of its economy, being able to create industries in that within the kingdom that allow for the employment of the bulk of Saudi citizens, and can serve as an economic engine, not just for Saudi Arabia, but for the region writ large. What happens as a result of that is that it directly addresses the grievance basis that had fueled so much of the revolutionary ideologies that groups like Al Qaeda, the Iranians, and a lot of that ilk, broadly described as violent extremist organizations, because you got to throw ISIS in there as well, have been spouting for decades. And this is how you consign those sick, twisted ideologies to the ash heap of history.
Fascinating, because we talk about Vision 2030 all the time, and we talk about it as a social and economic transformation, and your angle is it's not only that, it's also security transformation, in essence, by
Absolutely,
by removing potential recruits and all sorts of bad actors, not only by taking them out of play, but also reducing their attractiveness to the rest of the population.
And it's that latter point that is the key piece of it. Right. It's creating options and a future that cause the snake oil, if you will, that groups, that violent extremist, dead end organizations like Al Qaeda, ISIS, and all the rest of it offer as completely unattractive. Their potential pool of recruits looks at that and goes, yeah, no, this isn't working for what I want to do with my life, man. I've got better things to do.
So, and it's been fascinating talking with you both now and earlier in the week. And what so often happens when we do preliminary conversations, that's some great stuff that unfortunately we can't bring in here.
Wish we were recording, yeah.
Yeah.
It gets, this has been fantastic and content, and there's even better stuff. I mean, not better stuff, but there's equally good stuff that we'll leave on the cutting room floor. So, Colonel Gandy, you're an astute observer. You're right at the heart of this U.S. Saudi defense cooperation. Mm-hmm. You're seeing the fundamental changes. Why do you think it's not resonating? Or is it resonating in Washington, D.C.?
I think it is where it matters. Various political factions and or actors in the U.S. are going to are going to say whatever they're going to say, regardless of whatever reality on the ground happens to be. But I think where it matters, it is understood that change is occurring. Now, I would certainly wish that were more broadly understood, throughout the United States and throughout the world, because frankly, I think the Saudis have gotten a bad rap over the years, and that's unfortunate because the partnership really matters. And why do I say that? Well, on any given day, somewhere between 15 and 20% of the global shipping in the world goes through the Bab el-Mandeb, between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, coming south out of the Red Sea and flowing into the Indian Ocean. Mm-hmm. That's the commercial value. The other value is that same passage strait, Suez, Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, Indian Ocean, is the United States Navy's back door to the South China Sea. So in the event of a crisis, Taiwan maybe, or something else, the fastest way for the U.S. Navy to support and reinforce its forces already in the Pacific is to move them from the Mediterranean. There's only one way to do that in a matter of days, as opposed to a 2.5-week sail around the southern tip of Africa. Mm-hmm. And that's Suez, Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, Gulf of Aden, Indian Ocean. Having a solid partner whose geography runs the bulk of that route matters. No ifs, no ands, no buts. It really matters. It matters for commerce. And in some ways, and especially as you look at the global transition towards renewable energy, in many ways, the Suez, Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb passage is, for the 21st century, as important as the Strait of Hormuz ever was in the 1980s.
In terms of global energy conversion?
Well, and yeah, in terms of the global economy.
Right.
And oh, by the way, it matters even more because the Saudis are now talking about building a massive hydrogen plant on the west coast, a hop, skip, and a jump from the southern entrance of Suez.
Right.
Those kind of developments, which, oh, by the way, hopefully, that becomes a game changer in the renewable energy industry, because I think the Saudis are going to leapfrog a whole bunch of players in that particular market because they can, because they don't have, among other things, legacy industries to hinder them in the creation of that kind of stuff.
Right. They're investing.
Yeah, exactly. And oh, by the way, they've got the cash to do it. Right. And so, it is for all those kinds of reasons why stability and security matter, and having a partner in the form of the kingdom that is capable of being a significant contributor in its own right to the maintaining security and stability in that part of the world, which is so critical for the global economy writ large, really matters. And so supporting them is critical. And I think that lesson is certainly understood. Where it counts within the U.S. government. I wish it was understood more broadly.
We have touched on it, but there's a lot going on right now about sort of like where the U.S. Saudi relationship stands. We've talked a little bit about that, and there's a question of whether or not Saudi Arabia should or could or would pump more oil in response to higher energy prices. And then there's also talk about we talked about it a little bit earlier today, just sort of like when there was a kind of palpable, like discernible change in the U.S. Saudi defense relationship that just seems like maybe 10, 15 years ago, if someone were to invade or attack Saudi Arabia, it would mean U.S. direct support for Saudi Arabia with boots on the ground. And that may not be the case now. Then we also talked a little bit about how, like in Washington, there isn't a strong. Maybe Saudi Arabia is a little bit underappreciated. In order to have a treaty with Saudi Arabia, we would need 2/3 of the Senate, which seems completely unlikely at this point. And I guess my question is, how can the United States and Saudi Arabia enhance their military cooperation from here, if at all?
Well, so I think actually you heard the outgoing U.S. Central Command commander General McKenzie talk about that recently in some of his public statements about the importance of regional air and missile defense and supporting the development of that to where you have a truly integrated, regional air and missile defense coalition, and that is a goal. There is a entire GCC Defense Committee focused on that. But before I go any further, there's one thing you mentioned, and I think I'd like to kind of put a little bit of a contextual frame on that. So a lot of people talk about, well, in 1990, the U.S. sent 500,000 troops to the defense of Saudi Arabia. In 2019 and 2020, in the aftermath of the Abqaiq, it sent very small numbers. Well, you don't need 500,000 people to address an air defense mission. Was to stop an entire Iraqi army that had already overtaken one country, Kuwait, and was bearing down on the kingdom. So you send what's needed as opposed to what some pundits might say. Oh, well, you didn't send the same numbers. It's like, no, man, they're two completely different missions. And what is significant is that since then, certainly the Iran-based threats have not occurred. Now, there is a persistent problem out of Yemen. I mean, we just saw that with the attacks on Jeddah. That being said, what is equally remarkable is that you don't have significant loss of life associated with that. I mean, it's tragic that you have burning oil tanks, but the Saudis are doing a great job of defending 99% of their critical infrastructure. And it's kind of the challenge that they have is they have to be right 100% of the time, 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
Right.
The Houthis, to be successful, just got to get one through. That's that's hard.
And it's a challenge. It's a challenge.
And they have done and I got to take my hat off to them. I mean, if you want to ask anybody who has fired the most Patriot missiles against an active enemy anywhere in the world, it is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Royal Saudi Air Defense Force.
Colonel Brad Gandy, head of the U.S. military training mission in Saudi Arabia from 2019 to 2021. Brad, thank you so much for joining us. This was an awesome discussion. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate it.
Colonel Gandy, what a treat. Thank you so much. I know you're on to your next challenge. I know we'll stay in touch, and hopefully we'll get you back on the 966. It's been really great to have you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. This has been a treat, and like I keep telling people, you guys are a force for good. So thanks for what you're doing, and keep at it.